Hi everyone and welcome back to a new video review by Mirrorlessons. Today I'm going to talk to you about yet another telephoto zoom lens for a mirrorless system, the Fujifilm 100-400mm f4.5 5.6. This is the first serious offering from Fujifilm for wildlife photography, and it is also the second lens to be compatible with the 1.4 teleconverter. I found it useful for sports, and as you will see in the video, I used it in very challenging conditions. So let's get started. The first thing I want to say about this lens is that it is heavy. In comparison to other equivalent lenses I've been trying recently, this one was more tiring to hold after an entire day of use. When using the X-Pro 2 or the X-T1, the combo does feel a little front heavy, but you do get used to it after a while. The lens is still lighter than a DSLR equivalent, but the difference is more subtle. I also have to say that it is probably one of the best Fuji lenses when it comes to build quality. It is rock solid and is very well designed in every aspect. The lens is also weather sealed. I was able to test this aspect when I found myself caught in heavy rain during a motorbike race. A big hailstorm soon followed, so I had to run back to the car to protect myself, the camera and the lens. The X-Pro 2, the teleconverter and the lens were completely soaked, but the lens is still working fine as well as the camera, so I can confirm that the weather sealing is working really well. The aperture ring is precise and the zoom ring is also pleasant to use. I find it a little stiff near the end of the zoom range, but this is a minor complaint. The focus ring is of course a focus by wire type, but it is pleasant to use as well. The zoom ring can be locked at 100mm, otherwise the lens will tend to extend when carried in a vertical orientation. On the side, we have 3 switches to limit the focus distance, set the aperture to automatic or manual, and turn on or off the optical stabilization. I really like the lens hood. It has a clever lock mechanism and you need to unlock it to take it off so it won't move while you shoot. There is also a sliding door like on the 50-140mm that can be useful if you use a polarizing filter, for example. Finally, we have the tripod collar that can be rotated 360 degrees or removed with the 2 dedicated knobs. The Fuji 100-400mm gives you the same angle of view as a 150-600mm if we refer to 35mm format. The optical performance is on par with the other zoom lenses that Fujifilm has released. It is sharp wide open and throughout the entire zoom range. Again, if I compare the lens to other lenses I've been testing before, like for example the 100-400mm by Panasonic, I don't find the Fuji lens necessarily better, but it is definitely an excellent performer. If we look at some sharpness tests, we can see that the lens is very good at f5.6 and 400mm. You get peak performance at f8. From f11, diffraction starts to appear, and that happens at every focal length. The lens remains usable up to f16 for panning shots if you are working on a sunny day. With the same composition, I found sharpness to be approximately the same at 300mm and 400mm, so you can use the lens at any focal length really without worrying about a decrease in sharpness. While an S bokeh might not be the first thing you look for from a lens like this, I find it quite good. You don't wind up with too many hard edges or double lines, and it is smooth and pleasant in many of the shots I brought back home. You can encounter a swirly effect in some situations like this one, but once again I don't dislike it. The lens can focus as close as 1.75 meters, and at 400mm you can get quite close. I can show you a real-world example as I encountered this very friendly robin who was probably looking for some food. He let me get quite close to him and I took this at the shortest focus distance. I had to switch to manual focus because the autofocus couldn't handle such a short distance. As for vignetting and chromatic aberration, there is nothing to declare. It is all handled pretty well. You can find flare if you really look for it, but most of the time it won't be a problem. I used the lens on the X-Pro 2 mainly because I was interested in testing the new autofocus system, but I also took some shots with the X-T1. As far as the autofocus motor is concerned, the lens is very fast on both cameras. The autofocus motor is not completely silent, but it is very discreet, so I wouldn't worry about it. I used the lens in different situations, including birds in flight. an evening football game and a motorbike race. The X-Pro 2 does an excellent job in all these situations and is actually one of the most accurate mirrorless cameras I've tested in terms of autofocus performance. Just so you know, we began testing the Sony a6300 and it could be even better. By the way, it is the camera we are using right now to shoot this video. In single autofocus, both the X-T1 and the X-Pro 2 lock quickly onto a subject. It can struggle at short distances and with small subjects like a bird on a tree. To be fair, I've encountered this behavior with other cameras I've tested as well. In continuous autofocus, my favorite settings are continuous shooting at 8 frames per second and zone autofocus. This seems to be the optimal settings if you want the best results. For birds in flight, I use the largest zone area to have more leeway if the bird left the center of my frame while I was tracking it. For the motorbikes and the soccer game, I used a mix of the largest and middle zone areas. Overall, I'm quite surprised by the results. With both the motorbike race and the soccer game, my keeper rate was around 80%. The football game was an evening event, and because the lens isn't that fast, I had to raise my ISO to 12,800. Overall, the X-Pro 2 really did a fine job. Of course, in both cases I ended up with some autofocus shots or some slightly soft results, but it passed the test with flying colors. I tend to use focus priority for my reviews, but at the soccer game I also use release priority since many sports photographers are interested in that as well. To my surprise, the results were very similar. The only thing that can happen is if you suddenly raise the camera to your eye and take the shot without pre-focusing first, the camera can misfocus completely, but it will take the shot anyway because you set release priority. However, this only happened a couple of times. With birds in flight, my keeper rate was around 60%. Part of the reason is that I didn't always track the birds well enough, but it was also a more difficult testing ground. I also took some shots with the X-T1 and overall the autofocus performance was slower and less accurate. It is also a question of autofocus settings. On the X-T1 the zone IF is smaller than the one on the X-Pro 2, so you have less margin for error. The electronic viewfinder lag time is actually worse on the X-T1 than on the X-Pro 2. And speaking about viewfinders, I ran an interesting experiment by using the optical viewfinder of the X-Pro 2 for birds in flight with this lens. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? What I can say is that while it isn't perfect, it does actually work and I brought back some very interesting results. One advantage is that you don't have any lag, blackouts, or a decrease in the frame rate. Also, because the optical viewfinder is not connected to the lens or sensor, you get a wider view of the scene. This is actually very useful if you're following the bird and recomposing when it suddenly changes direction. Well, if you are interested, I suggest you check out my in-depth article on mirrorless.com about the topic. The lens features optical stabilization and Fujifilm claims 5 stops of compensation. I have to say that in my test I did achieve very good results. At 400mm I managed to get a sharp shot down to 1/8 of a second and 1/5 of a second at 100mm with both the X-T1 and X-Pro 2. As usual in the real world, remember that a higher shutter speed will always ensure more sharpness because no matter how still you are or how good the optical image stabilization is, your subject might not want to pose for you for too long. The optical image stabilization is also effective for video, as you can see from these samples. I also had the chance to use the lens with the 1.4 teleconverter. It basically makes the lens a 140 to 560mm, and in 35mm format terms this becomes a 210mm to 860mm, so it is quite long. The aperture goes from f6.7 to 8. I had the chance to use it once again on both the X-T1 and X-Pro 2 even in challenging conditions. The autofocus performance decreases on both cameras and the X-T1 struggled more. The autofocus may take more time to lock onto the subject and can be less accurate, especially for birds in flight. For the motorbike race, I got a better keeper rate, and considering the challenging rainy conditions, the combo did a very good job. There is a slight loss in sharpness too. It isn't anything to worry about, but I would use it at f8 to get the best results. So that's it for this video review of the Fujifilm 100-400mm. Overall, I consider this lens another winner when it comes to image quality and autofocus performance, especially when paired with the Fujifilm X Pro 2. The new autofocus system and the new sensor do improve the image quality, especially when you're dealing with difficult subjects like birds in flight. The only criticism I have, though I'm not sure I can call it that, is the size and weight. If you already are a Fuji shooter and were waiting for a super telephoto lens, then this is your only option right now. If you are using another system, you might be facing a trickier decision. Especially if you are in DSLR territory, you might find the overall size and weight of this combination not that different from, let's say, a Canon 7D Mark II with a Canon 100-400mm lens. Of course, the camera is smaller and lighter, so if you intend to use it with other smaller lenses as well, then it can be worth considering. But if you are mostly a wildlife photographer, you won't find much of an advantage regarding size and weight. As usual, don't hesitate to leave a comment if you have any question. I also suggest you visit meolesson.com, where you will find a full review of this lens and lots of sample images in full res that you can download. Thank you again for watching, please subscribe and see you next time. Bye bye!